Lula da Silva that Brazil will respond in kind with its own tariffs if the U.S. goes through what it wants to do by August 1. Your thoughts?
President Donald Trump's second-term trade doctrine has entered a volatile phase. In recent weeks, the administration has issued formal notices to a string of trade partners. 35% tariffs on Canada, 30% on Mexico, 50% on Brazil. These aren't just economic decisions. They are calculated power plays, and the world is responding. Rather than strengthening American leverage, Trump's tariff blitz is hardening resistance. Countries that once depended on U.S. trade are now coordinating responses, and in some cases, turning away altogether.
We both agree that it is essential to respect the USMCA trade agreements, and we shared our experiences about the letter we received from President Trump.
One of the clearest signs that Trump's pressure is backfiring came this week, when Canada and Mexico publicly pledged to strengthen bilateral trade. Both countries confirmed they had received tariff letters from the U.S., 35% for Canada, 30% for Mexico, set to take effect August 1st if negotiations fail. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum agreed to deepen economic cooperation. Carney is expected to visit Mexico in the coming weeks to formalize joint strategies. For two neighbors long tied to the U.S. through the USMCA, this pivot marks a significant realignment. Rather than fracture, Trump's tariff threats are pushing America's closest allies to close ranks, without the U.S.
Consider that maybe for the last 50 years, we are going through the worst moment in the relation between Brazil and Washington.
Tensions are even sharper further south. Brazil was hit with the steepest tariff, 50% on all exports to the U.S., up from 10% announced in April. Trump framed the move as retaliation for what he called political persecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces charges for his role in the January 2023 coup attempt. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva rejected the move as an act of political interference. His administration immediately activated a new fast response tariff mechanism, authorizing counter tariffs against U.S. goods. According to Brazil's Ministry of Development, only 12% of Brazilian exports are destined for the U.S., allowing the country to redirect trade with minimal disruption. The sectors affected include oil, orange juice, coffee, and steel. While the economic exposure is manageable, the diplomatic damage is real. Lula has publicly signaled a shift toward deeper ties with BRICS nations and Asian partners, a trend accelerated by Trump's moves.
This is unilateralism, and it's highly personalistic. It's President Trump because he doesn't like somebody. And, and I think it has very severe implications for U.S. relations with Latin America.
The ripple effects go beyond Brazil. In Colombia, relations have deteriorated rapidly after allegations emerged linking U.S. figures to an attempted political plot. Trump responded by recalling the U.S. ambassador and threatening to revoke Colombia's drug cooperation certification, a move that could cut vital aid. But instead of backing down, President Gustavo Petro has pushed back. His administration is now exploring deeper ties with BRICS institutions, including development financing outside the U.S. orbit. Across Latin America, a quiet realignment is underway. Countries are looking to diversify trade, reduce political exposure, and limit dependency on Washington. Trump's aggressive stance may be aimed at asserting dominance, but the region's reaction suggests it's having the opposite effect.
I mean, is it a political failure for the Prime Minister if Canada ends up with some level of tariffs at the end of this, or is it just the reality of dealing with Donald Trump?
What began as a strategy to strengthen U.S. leverage is now showing signs of unraveling. Rather than forcing deals on America's terms, the tariff campaign is driving partners together and away from Washington's orbit. Canada is no longer negotiating alone. Mexico is no longer avoiding alignment. Brazil, once neutral, is openly confronting U.S. influence. And in Europe, even close allies are preparing for long-term trade diversification. For the Trump administration, the short-term political optics may still resonate with parts of the domestic base. But the long-term cost is rising. Fractured trust, declining diplomatic capital, and global supply chains that are learning to work around, not through, the United States. The real impact of these tariffs may not be in what they tax. It may be in what they break.
You know, I grew up in Canada, where the entire trade mechanism is built toward trading with the United States. Canada is actively seeking to diversify its own trade relations. It's currently trying to finalize a free trade deal with a bloc of South Asian countries.
When President Trump talks trade, he talks about strength, about using tariffs to bring countries to the table. But as the summer of 2025 unfolds, something unusual is happening. The table is getting emptier. Yes, the talks are technically still on. Canada is negotiating. The EU hasn't walked away. Mexico is sending messages. But make no mistake, behind the press briefings and formal letters, America's closest allies are pulling back. And in the process, Trump's tariff strategy is not just straining relationships abroad. It's also hitting the U.S. economy at home. Hard.
This is America's biggest trading partner. Other countries are doing similar things. They're trying to figure out how to be less reliant on a trading partner that is unreliable and unpredictable.
After months of stalled dialogue, Trump's new round of tariff letters landed with a thud. 35% duties on Canadian goods, 30% on EU and Mexican exports, and 50% on copper, pharmaceuticals, and other sensitive items. The backlash was strategic. Canada accelerated deals with South Asia. The EU delayed its countermeasures but drafted a massive $72 billion retaliation list. Mexico continued talks but with reduced optimism. None of these countries slammed the door, but none are treating the US as a reliable partner anymore. Instead, they're working on long-term alternatives, and America is no longer in the center of their plans.
Past 3 months, this is when the tariffs went into place and companies either decided to absorb some of that, get inventory ahead of that deadline, or start to pass some of that on to the consumers.
While allies quietly pulled back, the real pain began showing up inside the U.S. economy. The 50% tariff on copper raised immediate concerns. The U.S. imports over half of its refined copper from allies like Canada, Peru, and Chile. But domestic refining capacity is limited. Tariffs only raised the cost, without improving supply. It was the same story with Brazilian coffee. With a 50% duty in place, prices spiked. But coffee isn't produced at scale in the US, except in Hawaii. Importing alternatives simply isn't feasible. American consumers bore the cost, with no gain in strategic security. Meanwhile, US companies and financial institutions began closely tracking the fallout. According to CBS News reporting, many businesses either tried to absorb the new costs, front-load inventory, or passed prices on to consumers. Attention also turned to household spending. Banks were watching whether American consumers, already stretched by inflation, were cutting back or falling behind on payments. Another area under scrutiny was investment. IPO activity and corporate mergers began to stall, driven by rising input costs and trade uncertainty. These developments raised questions not just about current earnings, but about confidence in the economy's direction. And as President Trump continued to publicly pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, especially around real estate, analysts noted that the White House was now seeking monetary relief to offset disruptions that its own trade decisions had helped create. Beyond immediate inflation and investment drag, a deeper shift is underway. The EU has signaled that its next wave of retaliation may target U.S. services, intellectual property, digital platforms, financial products. These are areas where the U.S. traditionally runs a surplus. If that surplus erodes, the U.S. loses not just income, but influence. Meanwhile, Canada is reviewing export permits for strategic minerals, including rare earths, copper, and uranium. Limiting exports to the U.S. would disrupt supply chains for EVs, AI chips, and clean tech manufacturing. According to projections from the IMF in June, a full trade breakdown with Canada and the EU could reduce U.S. GDP by up to 0.4%, with long-term investment loss in advanced sectors. What's emerging is not just a trade dispute, it's a structural split in the global economy, with the U.S. drifting to the sidelines.
Well, I think that's the key question, is what deal will be credible, will be sustainable, given the extreme uncertainty that's coming out of the Trump White House.
President Trump has argued that tough tariffs show strength. But what they've shown instead is isolation. While allies build new partnerships, the U.S. faces rising costs, anxious markets, and a weakening position in global trade. In the end, it's not just about how high the tariffs go, it's about how much trust is left when the dust settles. And right now, America's trading partners are quietly rebuilding a world that doesn't rely on Washington.
At all. And every one of Donald Trump's letters to these countries, every one of them in the last line says, and I, Donald Trump, can change any of these tariffs at any time, depending on, and this is the word he uses, our relationship with that country.
There was a time when allies stood close. Canada and Japan weren't just trading partners. They were pillars in America's global architecture, steady, reliable, and aligned. But today, those pillars are shifting. On July 10th, President Donald Trump announced a sweeping 35% tariff on all Canadian imports, effective August 1st. Just days earlier, Japan received notice of a 25% blanket tariff on its exports to the United States. These weren't isolated decisions. They were part of a larger pattern, one defined by disruption, volatility, and personal leverage. Allies who once believed in a stable trans-Pacific order are now asking a difficult question. If trust is gone, what's left to hold them here?
Trump goes on to say in that letter that if Canada raises its tariffs, quote, whatever number you choose to raise them by will be added onto the 35% that we charge.
Donald Trump's trade policy in 2025 has followed no conventional rulebook. Instead of structured trade frameworks, the president has relied on unilateral letters, announcing tariffs, shifting deadlines, and warning partners that duties could change based on the relationship. For Canada, the escalation has been relentless. After facing tariffs on aluminum, steel, and copper earlier this year, the new 35% duty stunned businesses across sectors. It came even as Canada was still in active bilateral negotiations with Washington, talks that were expected to conclude by July 21st. Rather than escalate publicly, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose a quieter path. Behind closed doors, his team worked to contain the fallout, while simultaneously moving Canada's economic focus outward. Canada has intensified trade negotiations with ASEAN, and in July, its foreign minister confirmed progress on a new free trade agreement. At the same time, Ottawa signed a defense and intelligence sharing pact with Tokyo, expanding security coordination in the Indo-Pacific. In Japan, the response has been firmer, but no less strategic. The 25% tariff letter from Washington triggered strong language from Tokyo. The Japanese government rejected what it called economic coercion and emphasized its commitment to protect domestic industries and employment. Yet even as negotiations with the U.S. continue, Japan is not waiting. Its economic ministers are expanding ties with Southeast Asia and Europe, reinforcing partnerships that don't come with strings attached. Taken together, the message is clear. Trump's tariff-first diplomacy is no longer just a tactic, it's become a turning point. And it's pushing countries to build new bridges beyond Washington.
And I am here, the Carney government's first visit to the Indo-Pacific, my first visit to the Indo-Pacific, to stress the importance of multilateralism. Multilateralism in trade and economic matters in particular.
Japan and Canada have taken a major step forward in deepening their strategic ties by signing a security information sharing agreement.
The Indo-Pacific is no longer just a strategic concept. It's becoming a new center of gravity for countries seeking balance, stability, and multilateral cooperation. For Canada, that means finalizing its FTA with ASEAN, strengthening LNG exports to Asia, and leveraging its role as a supplier of critical minerals. In the past month, Canadian LNG shipments have reached Malaysia, while Ottawa continues to court Petronas and other Asian energy players. Japan, meanwhile, is reinforcing its defense ties across the region and pushing for tighter cooperation with ASEAN nations, including Vietnam and Indonesia. Both nations, longtime U.S. allies, are now rebalancing. Not in protest, but out of necessity. Because in today's climate, diversification isn't just smart, it's essential. Trump promised 90 deals in 90 days. But what the world has seen are 90 days of confusion. Letters sent, tariffs threatened, and no binding agreements in sight. In that void, trust is eroding. Canada and Japan aren't turning hostile, they're adapting. Quietly, pragmatically, and with long-term interests in mind. What's emerging isn't anti-American, it's post-American. A world where allies still value U.S. partnership but no longer build their future around it. Because allies don't wait forever. And when tariffs replace trust, the world moves on.